Chapter 15 of Outwitting the Hun, My Escape from a German Prison Camp, by Pat O'Brien. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15, Observations in a Belgian City. One night, shortly before I left this city, our airmen raided the place. I didn't venture out of the house at the time, but the next night I thought I would go out and see what damage had been done. When it became dark, I left the house accordingly, and mixing with the crowd, which consisted largely of Germans, I went from one place to another to see what our strafing had accomplished. Naturally, I avoided speaking to any one. If a man or woman appeared about to speak to me, I just turned my head and looked or walked away in some other direction. I must have been taken for an unsociable sort of individual a good many times, and if I had encountered the same person twice, I suppose my conduct might have aroused suspicion. I had a first-class observation of the damage that was really done by our bombs. One bomb had landed very near the main railroad station, and if it had been only 30 yards nearer, would have completely demolished it. As the station was undoubtedly our airman's objective, I was very much impressed with the accuracy of his aim. It is by no means an easy thing to hit a building from the air when you are going at anywhere from 50 to 100 miles an hour and are being shot at from beneath from a dozen different angles, unless, of course, you are taking one of those desperate chances and flying so low that you cannot very well miss your mark, and the Huns can't very well miss you either. I walked by the station and mingled with the crowds which stood in the entrances. They paid no more attention to me than they did to real Belgians, and the fact that the lights were all out in this city at night made it impossible, anyway, for any one to get as good a look at me as if it had been light. During the time that I was in this city, I suppose I wandered from one end of it to the other. In one place where the German staff had its headquarters, a huge German flag hung from the window, and I think I would have given 10 years of my life to have stolen it. Even if I could have pulled it down, however, it would have been impossible for me to have concealed it, and to have carried it away with me as a souvenir would have been out of the question. As I went along the street one night, a lady standing on the corner stopped me and spoke to me. My first impulse, of course, was to answer her, explaining that I could not understand, but I stopped myself in time, pointed to my ears and mouth, and shook my head, indicating that I was deaf and dumb, and she nodded understandingly and walked on. Incidents of this kind were not unusual, and I was always in fear that the time would come when some inquisitive and suspicious German would encounter me and not be so easily satisfied. There are many things that I saw in this city which for various reasons it is impossible for me to relate until after the war is over. Some of them, I think, will create more surprise than the incidents I am free to reveal now. It used to amuse me, as I went along the streets of this town, looking in the shop windows, with German soldiers at my side looking at the same things, to think how close I was to them and they had no way of knowing. I was quite convinced that if I were discovered my fate would have been death, because I not only had the forged passport on me, but I had been so many days behind the German lines after I had escaped that they couldn't safely let me live with the information I possessed. One night I walked boldly across a park. I heard footsteps behind me and, turning round, saw 2 German soldiers. I slowed up a trifle to let them get ahead of me. It was rather dark, and I got a chance to see what a wonderful uniform the German military authorities have picked out. The soldiers had not gone more than a few feet ahead of me when they disappeared in the darkness like one of those melting pictures on the moving picture screen. As I wandered through the streets, I frequently glanced in the café windows as I passed. German officers were usually dining there, but they didn't conduct themselves with anything like the light-heartedness which characterizes the Allied officers in London and Paris. I was rather surprised at this, because in this part of Belgium they were much freer than they would have been in Berlin, where, I understand, food is comparatively scarce and the restrictions are very rigid. As I have said, my own condition in this city was in some respects worse than it had been when I was making my way through the open country. While I had a place to sleep and my clothes were no longer constantly soaking, my opportunities for getting food were considerably less than they had been. Nearly all the time I was half famished and I decided that I would get out of there at once, since I was entirely through with Huyliger. My physical condition was greatly improved. While the lack of food showed itself on me, I had regained some of my strength, my wounds were healed, my ankle was stronger, and although my knees were still considerably enlarged, I felt that I was in better shape than I had been at any time since my leap from the train, and I was ready to go through whatever was in store for me. Chapter 16